At 65 years old, Harland Sanders stood inside his restaurant and listened to a sound that frightened him more than any insult, any failure, or any rejection he had faced before. Silence. For years, the road outside his place in Corbin, Kentucky, had been alive with travelers. Cars pulled in for gasoline. Families walked through the door hungry and tired. Truck drivers sat down for a hot meal. Salesmen came in with dust on their shoes and stories from the road. His restaurant had been a stop for people who were going somewhere. Then the traffic began to disappear. A new highway changed the path of the travelers. The cars no longer needed to pass his door. The tables sat empty for longer. The cash register rang less often. The same business that once made him feel secure now felt like a room full of ghosts. Most men at his age would have taken the hint. They would have sold what they could, accepted the loss, and tried to live quietly on whatever money was left. At 65, the world often expects a man to slow down. It expects him to stop taking chances. It expects him to accept the ending. But Harland Sanders had never been good at accepting endings. He had already lived too many lives to believe that one more failure could finish him. He had been a farm boy. He had been a railroad worker. He had been a streetcar conductor. He had sold insurance. He had operated service stations. He had cooked for travelers. He had fought with trouble, poverty, pride, bad luck, and his own temper for most of his life. And now, with a failing restaurant, a small Social Security check of $105 a month, and a chicken recipe he believed in more than almost anything else, he had to answer one question: was his story over? Or was the real beginning still ahead? This is the story of Harland Sanders, the man the world would come to know as Colonel Sanders. But this is not just a story about fried chicken. It is a story about age, pride, rejection, reinvention, and the painful truth that sometimes life waits until you are nearly broken before it shows you what you are really made of. Long before the white suit, long before the famous face, long before Kentucky Fried Chicken became one of the most recognized restaurant names in the world, Harland David Sanders was a boy in Indiana who learned early that life was not going to be gentle with him. He was born near Henryville, Indiana, in 1890. He did not come from wealth. He did not grow up protected by comfort. His father died when Harland was still a child, and that loss changed the shape of his childhood. When a child loses a parent that young, something inside him often grows up too quickly. For Harland, responsibility came before ease. While other boys had time to play, he had younger siblings to help care for. His mother had to work, meals still had to be made, children still had to be fed, the house still had to function. So Harland learned to cook. At first, cooking was not a dream. It was not a business plan. It was not a brand. It was survival. He learned how to make food stretch. He learned how to feed people with what was available. He learned how much comfort could come from a hot meal placed on a table in a hard home. That lesson never left him. Food, to Harland Sanders, was never only food. It was care. It was dignity. It was a way of saying, "You are tired, you are hungry, you have been on the road, but sit down, you are welcome here." That feeling would become the heart of his business, even before he knew he had a business. But before he found that path, he spent years searching for his place in the world. His early life was not a clean success story. It was messy. He worked job after job. Some ended badly. Some did not last. Some were lost through circumstance. Some through conflict, and some through the sharp edges of his own personality. He was not the kind of man who fit easily into the system of another person. He had pride. He had a temper. He had energy that did not sit still. He could be charming, but he could also be difficult. He could work hard, but he did not always bend easily. That made life harder. But it also made him impossible to erase. For many years, Harland Sanders seemed like a man always starting over. Just when one life looked stable, it shifted. Just when one job looked promising, it ended. He moved from one opportunity to another, carrying both hunger and frustration with him. Some people spend their youth building a straight road toward success. Sanders spent his building a map of detours. And yet, every detour taught him something. The railroad taught him movement. Sales taught him persuasion. Service stations taught him travelers. Hard times taught him how quickly security can disappear. Cooking taught him that a meal could turn a stranger into a regular customer. by the time he reached middle age. He was not a polished businessman. He was something rougher and more useful. He was a survivor who understood ordinary people. He understood men who were tired after driving all day. He understood families who counted every dollar. He understood customers who did not want fancy food. They wanted something hot, honest, and good. Around the age of 40, Sanders began running a service station in Corbin, Kentucky. It was not the kind of place that looked like the beginning of an empire. It was a stop along the road. Cars came in. Drivers needed fuel. Travelers needed directions. People needed restrooms, conversation, and sometimes something to eat. Sanders began serving food to the travelers who stopped there. Not because he had a grand plan to change American restaurants. He saw hungry people. And he knew how to cook. At first, the meals were simple, but people noticed. They came for more than gasoline. They came for the food. Word spread along the road. The way good roadside food used to spread before online reviews and glowing screens. One person told another. A driver told a salesman. A family stopped again on the way home. Slowly, the food became the attraction. And among the dishes he served, the chicken became the thing people remembered. But fried chicken was not easy to serve quickly. Traditional pan-fried chicken took time. Too much time for travelers who wanted a meal but needed to get back on the road. Sanders had a problem that would shape the rest of his life. How could he cook chicken that tasted like home but serve it fast enough for the modern roadside? This was where his stubbornness became useful. He experimented, he adjusted, he tested seasonings, he worked with cooking methods. He searched for a way to make chicken that was tender, flavorful, consistent, and fast. In the late 1930s, he developed the method and seasoning blend that would become famous. The pressure cooking method helped him serve chicken faster while keeping it moist. His blend of 11 herbs and spices became part of the legend. People loved to talk about secret recipes because secrets make success feel magical. But the real secret was not only in the seasoning. The real secret was that Sanders cared with almost painful intensity. He cared about the crust. He cared about the moisture. He cared about the timing. He cared about whether the gravy tasted right. He cared about details that many people would have ignored. To some, that made him demanding. To others, it made him unreasonable. But to Sanders, the food had to be right because his name was on it, even before the world knew his name. There is a difference between a person who sells food and a person who sees food as reputation. Harland Sanders was the second kind. His restaurant grew. Travelers came. The roadside stop became a place people remembered. He built not just a meal, but an experience of welcome. For a time, it looked as if the long search of his life had finally led somewhere stable. He had a restaurant. He had customers. He had a recipe. He had recognition. The governor of Kentucky gave him the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel, a title that later became inseparable from his public identity. At an age when many people are still wondering who they are, Sanders seemed to have found himself. But life has a habit of testing people right after they begin to feel safe. The restaurant in Corbin depended on the road. That was its strength, and it was also its weakness. As long as cars came past the door, Sanders had a chance. As long as travelers needed a place to stop, the restaurant could live. But if the road changed, everything could change with it. And that is exactly what happened. Traffic patterns shifted, a highway junction moved. Then a new interstate route threatened to bypass his restaurant entirely. For a roadside business, being bypassed is not a small inconvenience. It is like having the river move away from a water mill. The building may still be standing. The tables may still be set. The kitchen may still be ready, but the life source is gone. Sanders could see what was coming. The travelers would not stop if they never passed him. The families would not come in if the new road carried them somewhere else. The thing he had spent years building could die, not because the food was bad, not because he stopped working, not because he lost his skill, but because the world changed direction. That is one of the hardest kinds of failure. It does not feel fair. When you fail because you were lazy, you can blame yourself. When you fail because you made a foolish choice, you can learn from it. But when you fail because the road moved, because progress passed around you, because the world no longer needs to come through your front door, the pain is different. You can do everything right and still be left behind. Sanders sold the restaurant. He did not sell it from a place of triumph. He sold it because he understood that the business he had counted on was no longer safe. He was in his 60s. He had worked for decades. He had finally built something that people loved. And then, just when he might have expected rest, he was forced to start again. Picture that moment. Not the logo, not the bucket, not the white suit. Picture an older man with a lifetime of work behind him and no clear future in front of him. Most people know the end of the story, so they forget how desperate the middle must have felt. At 65, Sanders was not standing on the edge of fame. He was standing on the edge of defeat. His Social Security check was $105 a month. That was not a fortune. It was not enough to make a man feel powerful. It was a reminder that the world had placed him in the category of the old enough to receive a check, old enough to be expected to step aside, old enough for others to think his ambitious years were finished. But Sanders had one thing left that the highway could not take. He had the chicken. More than that. He had the belief that if restaurant owners tasted it, if they cooked it the right way, if they followed his method, they could sell it. So he made a decision that sounds simple only after you know it worked. He would go on the road. He would not wait for customers to come to him anymore. He would carry his recipe to other restaurants. He would cook for owners, persuade them and ask them to pay him a small royalty for every chicken they sold using his method. That decision changed everything, but at the time, it must have looked almost foolish. An older man traveling from place to place, trying to convince restaurant owners to let him into their kitchens. He was not a young founder in a modern office with investors waiting outside. He was not backed by a large corporation. He did not have a glossy national campaign. He had a pressure cooker, seasoning, experience, stubbornness, and the ability to walk into a restaurant and ask for a chance. That sounds romantic now. It was probably exhausting. He drove long distances. He slept where he could. He cooked demonstrations. He talked to people who did not know him, did not need him, and often did not want another old man telling them how to run their business. Some said no, many said no. Some probably smiled politely and waited for him to leave. Others may have looked at his age and assumed the idea was too late. That is the pain of starting over late in life. People do not only reject your idea, they reject the version of you that still believes. They look at your gray hair, your wrinkles, your old car, your tired hands, and they quietly decide that your moment has passed. But Sanders kept going. There is a kind of faith that does not look holy. It looks stubborn. It looks irritating. It looks like a man who refuses to accept the obvious. For Sanders, the obvious was that he should stop, but he did not stop. He kept offering his chicken. He kept explaining the method. He kept asking for a chance, and eventually, he found people willing to listen. One of the most important was Pete Harmon, a restaurant owner in Salt Lake City, Utah. Harmon became the first major franchisee connected to the Kentucky Fried Chicken name. What began as a regional specialty on a menu in Utah became the beginning of something much larger. The idea worked because it solved a problem. Restaurants could serve a distinctive product without Sanders owning every restaurant himself. Sanders could grow his concept through other operators. Instead of building one restaurant at a time, he could spread a method, a name, and a standard. It was not the same as running the Corbin restaurant. It was bigger. It was riskier. It was harder to control, but it gave Sanders something the old roadside business never could: reach. Kentucky Fried Chicken began to move across the country. The name was powerful because it carried a place with it. Kentucky sounded Southern, traditional, flavorful, and authentic to many Americans. Fried chicken was familiar, but the brand made it feel special. The bucket made it easy for families. The white suit made Sanders unforgettable. He understood something many companies spend fortunes trying to learn. People do not remember only food. They remember characters. They remember stories. They remember faces. Harland Sanders became the face. The white suit was more than clothing. It became a uniform of trust. The black string tie, the white hair, the goatee, the Southern courtesy, the title of colonel, all of it turned him into a living symbol. He did not look like a cold corporation. He looked like a man who might have cooked for you himself. That was the genius of the brand. Before the modern world filled every screen with polished advertising, Sanders made himself the advertisement. He traveled. He inspected. He promoted. He shook hands. He posed for pictures. He taught people how the chicken should be made. And as the franchises grew, his face grew with them. But success did not make him soft. If anything, it made his standards harder to live with. Sanders cared deeply about quality. He believed the food had to be made properly. He did not want the recipe treated casually. He did not want shortcuts. He did not want gravy that tasted wrong. He did not want the name Kentucky Fried Chicken attached to something he considered careless. This is where the story becomes more complicated, because building an empire often requires letting go. But Sanders was not naturally built to let go, the very trait that made him succeed. His refusal to compromise became painful once the company grew beyond his hands. When a business is small, obsession can be strength. When a business becomes huge, obsession can become conflict. Sanders wanted the chicken to remain personal. The company needed it to become scalable. Those two needs do not always live peacefully together. By the early 1960s, Kentucky Fried Chicken had grown rapidly. There were hundreds of franchised outlets. Sanders was no longer simply a man trying to survive after losing his restaurant. He had become the founder of a national business. In 1964, he sold the company to a group of investors for $2 million. For most people, that would have been the dream ending. An older man who had nearly been ruined by a highway had built a business so valuable that investors paid millions for it. But the ending was not simple. Sanders remained the public face of Kentucky Fried Chicken. But the company was no longer fully his. His image stayed. His name stayed. His legend grew. But control moved away from him. And for a man like Sanders, that was not easy. He had spent his life fighting to make the chicken right. Now other people controlled what customers tasted. He later became openly critical of the food in some restaurants connected to the brand. He complained about quality. He criticized changes. He fought, sometimes loudly, with the very company that had made him rich and famous. To some people, this made him difficult, but from his point of view, he was defending the thing that had saved his life. The chicken was not just a product. It was his second chance. It was the answer to the question he faced at 65. Was he finished? Kentucky Fried Chicken had answered no. So when he believed that answer was being weakened, he reacted with the fury of a man who had too much of himself invested in it. There is a lesson here that is easy to miss. The world often praises founders for building companies, then expects them to quietly step aside when the company grows beyond them. But how does a person step aside from something that gave meaning to his final chapter? How does a man who fought for every detail accept that the details now belong to committees, executives, suppliers, and systems? Sanders could not fully separate himself from the brand because the brand had been built from him. His face was on the sign. His title was in the story. His recipe was the promise. His age was part of the miracle. That made him powerful. But it also trapped him. He became both a man and a symbol. And symbols are not always allowed to be human. The public saw the cheerful colonel. They saw the white suit. They saw the smile. They saw the friendly figure connected to Sunday dinners, roadside meals, and buckets of chicken. But behind the symbol was a man who had been shaped by hunger, work, loss, anger, risk, and a lifetime of starting over. That is why his story still matters. It is not because everyone should start a restaurant at 65. It is not because every late-life idea becomes an empire. It is because Sanders proved something quieter and more uncomfortable. A person can be nearly written off by the world and still have one useful thing left. One skill, one recipe, one standard, one stubborn belief, one reason to get back in the car. For Sanders, that one thing was chicken. For someone else, it might be a craft, a song, a farm, a store, a small invention, a story, a lesson, or a promise made years ago. The form does not matter as much as the refusal to believe that age alone has the right to close the door. But the story is not only inspirational, it is also a warning. Sanders did not become successful because life was fair. Life was not fair to him. His father died when he was young. He worked hard for years without becoming famous. He lost the security of his restaurant because the road changed. He had to travel and face rejection at an age when many people want rest. Even after success came, peace did not come easily. The company grew beyond his control. The food he loved became part of a system he did not always trust. The man who became the face of a global brand spent his later years still arguing about gravy, taste, standards, and whether the thing carrying his name was worthy of it. That is not a simple fairy tale. That is what makes it human. Real success often comes with a bill. Sanders paid his bill in exhaustion, conflict, and the strange loneliness of watching the world love an image of you while not always understanding the person behind it. He had become famous, but fame is not the same as being understood. He had become wealthy, but wealth is not the same as control. He had become beloved, but love from the public is not the same as peace. Still, it is impossible to ignore what he did. He took failure at an age when many people would have surrendered, and turned it into motion. He took a dying roadside business and turned its best idea into a national franchise. He took a recipe shaped in a small Kentucky kitchen and made it part of American food culture. He took the image of an older Southern gentleman in a white suit and made it one of the most recognizable commercial faces in the world. And he did it after the world had every reason to think his best years were behind him. That is why the opening scene matters so much. The quiet restaurant, the empty tables, the missing traffic, the old man with a small check and a decision to make. If Sanders had accepted that moment as the end, the world would remember none of this. There would be no legend, no famous bucket, no white suit on signs around the world, no story about a man who started again when others would have stopped. Everything depended on what he did after the road moved. That is the part of the story that belongs to everyone, because sooner or later, every life has a road that moves. A job disappears, a marriage ends, a business fails, children leave home, health changes, technology passes you, the town changes, the industry changes, the world no longer comes to your door. And when that happens, the question is the same one Sanders faced. Is this the end? Or is this the moment you stop waiting for the world to come to you and carry what you have out into the world? Sanders could not move the highway back. He could not force the travelers to return. He could not make his old restaurant safe again. So he changed the direction of his life. He went to the customers, the restaurant owners, the roads, the towns, the kitchens, the chances. That shift is the heart of reinvention. Not pretending the loss did not happen. Not denying that the old life is gone, but asking what part of it can still be carried forward. Sanders lost the restaurant, but he carried the recipe. He lost the traffic, but he carried the reputation. He lost the old road, but he found new roads. That is why his story still works after all these years. It is not really about chicken. It is about the part of a person that refuses to die when circumstances die. It is about the late chapter that nobody expects. It is about the small skill you may have spent your whole life developing without realizing that, one day, it might become your way back. Harland Sanders lived long enough to see his face become famous across the world. He lived long enough to see the company grow far beyond anything the old Corbin restaurant could have become. He lived long enough to become not just a businessman, but a piece of American folklore. When he died in Louisville, Kentucky in 1980, he was 90 years old. By then, the world knew the Colonel, but the most important part of his story had happened before most of the world was watching. It happened when he was alone with failure. It happened when the restaurant was dying. It happened when the check was small. It happened when people had no reason to believe in him except the taste of the chicken and the force of his conviction. That is where the real story lives. Not in the fame, not in the logo, not in the money, but in the decision to begin again. There is something deeply American about that decision. America has always loved stories of reinvention, but it often loves them most after they succeed. It celebrates the founder after the company grows. It celebrates the dream after the risk works. It celebrates the old man after the world discovers he was right. But the courage happens earlier. The courage happens before the first. Yes, before the first franchise becomes famous. Before the first investor understands. Before the public sees a legend. The courage happens when an aging man looks at a failed plan and says, "There is still something here worth trying." That is what Sanders did, and that is why his life speaks so strongly to people who feel they have been passed by, people who think they are too old, people who think their moment is gone, people who have watched younger faces take the opportunities, people who have lost the business, the job, the house, the marriage, or the road that once brought customers to the door. His story does not promise that everyone will build an empire. That would be false. But it does offer a harder and more useful truth. You may not be finished just because one chapter closed. You may not be useless just because the world stopped coming to you. You may still have something that can travel. A skill can travel. A standard can travel. A story can travel. A recipe can travel. A reputation can travel. A stubborn heart can travel. Harland Sanders did not wait to feel young again. He did not wait for perfect conditions. He did not wait for the road to reopen. He got in the car. That may be the simplest and strongest image of his life. An older man on the road, carrying a pressure cooker, a seasoning blend, and a belief that his best idea had not yet found its audience. Every rejection could have sent him home. Every closed door could have confirmed what others already believed. Every empty mile could have reminded him that he was tired. But he kept going long enough for the story to change. That is what separates an ending from a turning point. Sometimes they look exactly the same when you are standing inside them. The dying restaurant looked like an ending. The small check looked like an ending. The lost traffic looked like an ending. The age of 65 looked like an ending. But for Harland Sanders, it became the beginning of the chapter that made him unforgettable. That is why people still tell this story. Not because fried chicken changed the meaning of life, but because a man near the age when society expected him to fade away refused to disappear. He turned a recipe into a roadmap. He turned rejection into mileage. He turned age into authority. He turned a white suit into a promise. And he turned one last chance into a legacy. In the end, Harland Sanders did not simply build Kentucky Fried Chicken. He built proof that the final act of a life can still be the most powerful one. And maybe that is why, long after his death, the old story still has flavor. Because somewhere, there is always someone standing in a quiet room, listening to the silence after the world has moved on. Someone whose road has changed. Someone who wonders if it is too late. Someone who has one skill, one idea, one memory of what used to work, and one small reason to try again. For that person, the story of Colonel Sanders is not really about a restaurant. It is about the courage to leave the ruins of what was comfortable and carry what still matters into the unknown. It is about looking at a life that seems finished and saying, not yet, not yet. Not while there is still a road ahead. Not while there is still work to do. Not while one good thing remains in your hands. And for Harland Sanders, that one good thing was enough.